Hello and welcome to another episode of Watercolour Wednesday with me, Rebecca Jarman. In today's episode I'm going to take you through step by step how to create this abstract bird painting, and I'm also going to show you how to use these embossing tools to create patterns on the surface of your watercolour paper. Also included in today's episode is a free PDF download of the reference image to trace onto your watercolour paper too. So let's get started. So what I'll be using today in this class are going to be some tools that I meant to use in class 15, episode 15 of Back to Basics. So I talked about these embossing tools. They're just wooden little handles with metal on the ends with little spikes. Well, they're not actually spikes. There's tiny little balls on the end of each one that are different sizes. Got a few here, a range of them. So I'm going to be using these. If you don't have embossing tools, you could use a toothpick or a nib of a pen. You could also use a ballpoint pen that's run out. That's really good. Anything with a sharp, well, a hard point or tip to it is what you want to be using. You could actually use the end of a paintbrush if you press on nice and firm. So I've just got a number 8 brush that I'll be using. I've already mixed up my colours. I'm going to be using Payne's Grey, sap green, and also green gold as well. So this one's going to be much more sort of monochrome, very limited palette. So same techniques as last class, in that we're going to be using wet in wet across this bird picture. This time I have included a free PDF download for you. So this is what you'll get. If you have a look at the link below this video, you'll find the link to the PDF. Just click it, download and print at home, then trace your image through to your watercolour paper. If you don't know how to, I use a really simple technique. I take a graphite pencil and I scribble on the back of the image, turn it over, place it where I want it on the watercolour paper, and I press the outline through with a normal HB pencil. Here's a link above to a video showing you that technique step by step if you want to check that out first. But as you can see, I've already transferred my image to my watercolour paper. This time I'm using a square format. It's 10 inches by 10 inches. And like I say, I'm going to be using these embossing tools, lots of wet in wet. You can use whatever colours you like. You can go to town with lots of different sort of pinks and purples and maybe mix it up. You could go lights and darks. You could do warms mixed with cools. You could do any kind of colour palette you like. But this time I'm going to rein it in a little bit. I used a lot of colours in the last episode, so that's why I'm going for a much more monochromatic kind of range of colours. So let's get started. Just a quick pause, folks. If you're enjoying this class, give me a thumbs up and a like. And if you'd like to see more free watercolour tutorials from me, then click subscribe. And also don't forget, hit the bell icon too, and that way you'll get a notification each time I upload another watercolour tutorial. Let's get back to the class. As you can see, I've now stuck my paper down to a board. Because we're using a lot of water and wet washes, you'll find that your paper wants to stretch. And if you don't stick it down thoroughly on all 4 sides, it will really cockle and move about. So stick it down and it'll make things a little bit easier for you. Before we even approach this painting or apply any water to the paper, I'm going to take my embossing tools and I want to draw some patterns over the surface. So I'm going to use this thicker tool first of all, and I'm going to start by creating, let's make some swirly marks. So I'm just pressing the tip into the paper surface and I'm kind of drawing some swirly patterns. Now it's going to be very difficult for you to see this on camera, but I'm putting quite a lot of pressure down and I'm just sort of going around. I'm not taking too much care as to where I'm drawing. I'm going into the background, as you can see, and also through the image as well. So those are some swirly marks, and that's going to leave quite a wide impression. Now I'm going to take a slightly smaller tipped embossing tool and I'm going to create some different marks. So let's say I'm going to do some lines. Let's do some lines. So I'm going to just use little short linear marks across any areas that I think I want to place them. So I'm not thinking too much about this. Like I say, I'm going into the background of the drawing as well. So I'm not just focusing on in between my drawn lines. I'm going into the background because I'd like that to have some patterns on as well. And so I've got some linear strokes. Let's put some lines. They can go in different directions, of course. They don't have to go in the same direction. You can vary the length. You can vary how close together they are. So let's do some going across like that. And maybe, I think also let's have some sort of curved lines, slightly curvy but close together. Let's do that on the bird as well. Just some marks that can cut through what you've already created too. So that's linear, so that's sort of repetitive lines. First of all, I did swirls, and I think what I might do this time actually is take a smaller tool and do some circles, individual circles. Now you can obviously take your time with this. Don't feel that you need to rush this part. It's actually quite therapeutic to be making these little marks, and obviously all will be revealed when we apply the paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed up the video now and continue creating all these marks until I've almost filled the entire page. Welcome back. So we've got all the patterns down now that I wanted to. I'll just try and give you a close-up and see if you can see any of those lines at all on the surface. If you look from an angle at your work, you'll be able to see where you've pressed into the paper and made these little indentations, and that way you can find out whether you've missed any sections at all. So I'm happy that I've covered everything that I wanted to. It's absolutely full of patterns, circles, I've done some zigzag lines, some sort of cross-hatching lines too. I'm happy with that. Now it's ready to take the next step. So have your paints ready, whatever colour it is you want to use first. Take up a nice large brush. So this is my number 8 round brush, my Da Vinci Casaneo. And I think, let's see, so shall we start? I think what I'll do is I'll start with the lightest colour, which is my green gold. So I'm going to pick up some of the green gold. And before I do that, sorry, take a larger brush. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Take a larger brush, wet it with some water, and I want you to just wet an area that you're going to place that green gold. Well, I'm using green gold. Obviously, you're going to be using whatever colour it is you want to use, but you want to pre-wet that area. So I'm just going to use this top right hand corner to begin with. I'm going to apply the paint in that area, and then I'm going to take my green gold and I'm just going to lay it down kind of wherever it is you want to lay it, and you should begin to see, I'm going to pick up some more paint, should begin to see where you've created those marks. So you know what happens is the paint sinks in to those indentations and reveals the pattern to you. So I'm going to now go into some of the grey. This is Payne's grey, and I'm going to let that blend in to some areas of my green gold. I'm going to lighten it up with some water here on the side, and maybe dab in some little spots of paint. So you can see that the edges are nice and soft because I lay down some water to begin with. So that's a lovely soft pattern there. I'm now going to go into some of the green, the other green that I've got in my palette. So this one is sap green. I'm going to do the same. I like these sort of dotty marks. That's quite pretty. And bring some up into the grey as well. So this is where you can sort of play about with your paint, be quite expressive with your mark making, but it's revealing those patterns that you lay down with the embossing tools or whatever tools it was you were using. So we are playing about with paint. I may actually bring in a little bit, I love salt, bring in a little salt here and there to make it even more interesting. And then moving on to the next section, I'll do the top left section now. So back into the water to wet that section, and some of these paints that I already have down will run into this other section as well, which is lovely. All of that helps. So we don't really want any hard edges at this stage, just wetting below the bit that I just painted here because I was starting to get some quite hard lines. So I'm just wetting around that area to make sure it's all nice and soft. So cleaning off my brush then, and I'm going to go back into, let's use the green gold again. So picking up some more green gold paint, placing it down, and as you can see it wants to blend nicely with what's already on the page. Picking up some of the sap green and doing exactly the same thing. So you play about with the paint however you like. Need to be reasonably quick. The paper will dry, So you want everything kept nice and soft. I've got some lovely patterns occurring over here. Going into my Payne's Grey now. Bring some Payne's Grey across this section, which is really nice. That's lovely. And then I'm going to take my other brush. I know I'm not using clean water, folks, but everything's going to blend together anyway, so it's okay. So wetting the next section so that excuse me, the painting aspect of this is really rather quick. You don't want to sorry about that, you don't want to hang around. Move quite quickly, be really positive with your brush strokes, making those marks, getting the paint down, and cover that paper. So I'll just speed up the rest of it for you. So as you can see here, I completed the painting. I added a little bit more salt down the bottom. I've allowed it to dry, and then I've actually transferred some of the reference image. I traced the lines again. I lined it back up because I'd lost some of those drawn pencil marks. Because of using so much water, occasionally that happens. So I've actually redrawn the lines so that I've got a good guide for doing the next step. Just to let you know, while I was painting, I actually found that some of the marks that I made with these embossing tools were getting lost because as you add water to the paper, as you know, it stretches. So what was happening was the water was going into some of the indentations, but as the paper was stretching, we were losing some of those marks. So what I found was I applied the paint to the paper, and if I wanted some of these marks to stand out further, I just went back over with the embossing tools in those areas to create some more defined marks. So you can see here in this area, so I went around those marks, I did these circles again. Some of these dark lines I went over again with the embossing tools, because if you look in the background area here, the embossed marks have almost disappeared in those areas. They're much fainter than I wanted them to be. So actually, if I were to do this again, I'd probably apply all the paint first and then quickly go in with the embossing tools and create all the marks I wanted to once the paper was wet, with the paint down on the surface. So that's something I learnt. Other things that I did were I initially put the paint down wet in wet with lots of soft fluffy edges, but then afterwards I went back into the paint and created sort of more definite marks here and there as well. So some of the areas have got some slightly harder lines and things like that. It creates more pattern and interest to the painting. So the next step is to check your lines. If some are a little faint, just take a HB pencil and draw around them. Make sure you've got a good outline to go by. And today I'm using, let me just grab it, some gouache, some white gouache paint. In the last episode, in episode 15, if I bring that image over, I used white acrylic paint in the background, which is really nice. It works well. It's very opaque. But this time, rather than taking the white paint all the way to the edge of the painting, I want to see some of this background. So I'm going to stop the white paint and fade it out and reveal some of these beautiful painting areas in the background as well. So this time I'm using gouache instead of white acrylic paint. I'm using my flat brush, and I will show you how to approach this. So for example, let's work on the top section here. So I've just damped the bristles. Now you don't want a wet brush, you just want it to be slightly damp, because actually you want the paint to be nice and thick. And gouache is a little thinner than acrylic, so you don't want to water it down at all. And I'm just taking the brush and I'm going around the edge, covering some of that background with the white paint to basically highlight or block out some of the background and highlight the shape, pull out the shape. So I'm going to drag some of that white paint out, but I'm going to stop it about there. So now I can still see some of the background in this corner. So I'm just going around the bird's beak at the moment, if you can see that. So, and then I'm going to drag some of that white paint out, and it sort of fades out on its own. There we go. So this beak and part of his head and his chest is now sort of sticking out in front of the background. So you want to go around the entire image in that same way. You don't actually have to use white paint for this. You could use black paint, or you could use, for me, for example, I could actually use the really thick dark Payne's grey or something like that. That would be nice. But I really like the effect the white paint has against all the colours that I've used. And similarly, in my previous episode, you can see I've used greens, pinks, oranges, some Payne's grey as well. Lots of different colours, some dull, some bright, but the white paint really helps those colours to stand out against the background. So I really like the effect the white paint has, but by all means have a go with other colours and see what you can make of those. You might, like I say, you might want to choose perhaps a colour that you've used. For example, I would use the Payne's grey, I think, because that's nice and dark, and that would work quite well in my painting, in my colour palette. But obviously you've chosen your own colour palettes, and you just basically go around with your brush. If you find it's not standing out too much, then you may need another coat of the gouache paint. But do a little bit and stand back from your painting and see if it works. So I'm going to continue in the same way, and I'll speed this part of the video up for you. Really pleased with this, and I want to take you through a few tips on success to create the marks with the embossing tools. So I've got 3 really good tips for these for you. So tip 1 is make sure you use a firm pressure when you're creating your marks on the paper. That way they won't get lost when you apply the paint and the water. Cover the page with marks, so make sure you go to town with the mark making and cover the entire surface. Sometimes I say less is more. In this instance, it's definitely not more. More is more for this particular painting. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3 is use a variety of mark making, you know, so I did some sort of spirally, swirly shapes. I did very linear shapes too. Vary the thicknesses of your lines. Do long lines, short lines. So variety is really key to creating an effective piece. Now I've got a couple of bonus tips for you as well. So bonus tip number 1 is make sure you use a dark line when you're transferring your reference image at the beginning of this painting. So I found that I lost quite a lot of my traced lines. So if you ensure right at the start that you have a lovely dark outline to your drawing, then you should be fine. And bonus tip number 2 is apply 2 coats of the gouache white paint if you need to. So I found that because gouache obviously blends with the water, and it can reactivate the watercolour paint beneath the layer of gouache, and so it can soften that white and you sort of lose it. If you want a more definite white outline and background, then you're going to want to apply 2 coats of that white gouache paint. Alternatively, you can use white acrylic paint, white acrylic ink. That's great as well. Try them all out and see which ones you prefer. So I'll see you next week, guys, for another episode of Watercolour Wednesday. Take care.